Good evening, and welcome to the April 27th, 2018 edition of Sex Addiction in the News on Facebook Live, Fridays at 5 p.m. Pacific, broadcasting from Seattle, Washington. I'm Stacy Sprout, a licensed psychotherapist, certified sex addiction therapist, and author of a book about my own story of healing titled Naked in Public, a memoir of recovery from sex addiction and other temporary insanities. Thank you for joining me this evening. I created this broadcast because I'm passionate about destigmatizing the public conversation about sex addiction and love addiction and porn addiction so that those afflicted, whether it's individuals, couples, families, and communities, can get help now. The show is intended to be educational, created for anyone who is interested in what the world is saying about sex addiction. Now, according to viewer response, the format of the show is going to be changing starting officially next week, but I'll talk about that more at the end of the show. But tonight, without further ado, thank you for tuning in, and let's see what the world is saying. And again, we go back to the UK, a country from my research I would venture to call the world's leading reporter on sex, love, and porn addiction. This article was published April 22nd, written by Andrew Anthony. It's titled Sexual Addiction, Desire, and Dopamine Hits. It discusses the recent high publicity cases of alleged sexual addiction, particularly Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, who are said to have pursued sex addiction treatment inpatient at the Meadows Treatment Center in Arizona, USA. The article reads, Meadows runs a men-only program entitled, a little ironically in Weinstein's case, Gentle Path, which lasts 45 days. Participants are assessed as to their position on the sex addiction spectrum. According to the program designed by Dr. Patrick Carnes, the leading expert in the field who first popularized the term sex addiction. Now, he has 3 levels, and I'll go over them here that are listed in the article. Level 1 of sex addiction includes overuse of porn or masturbation and visiting prostitutes at strip clubs. Level 2, he includes victimization, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and harassment. And level 3 is rape, incest, and child sexual abuse. Carnes believes most people with addiction problems are at a level 1 or 2. This is from the article. Going back to the Meadows, the writer says, the residents of the center undergo group, individual, and family therapies. In a nurturing community, they also engage in meditation, exercise programs, spiritual practices, and lectures. By all accounts, the food and accommodation leave little to be desired. The aim is for residents to, quote, gain the courage to face difficult issues, including grief and loss, heal from emotional trauma, and become accountable for their own feelings, behaviors, and recovery. This story also featured certified sex addiction therapist Paula Hall, who runs the Laurel Center, a specialist organization in Leamington Spa dedicated to sexual addiction therapy. Hall said she believes the publicity surrounding recent high-profile scandals has been very detrimental to an understanding of what she believes is a real and growing problem about sex addiction. She emphasizes the distinction between sex addiction and sexual offenses. She tells the reporter, there is a percentage of people who are sexually addicted and offend. It absolutely in no way excuses the offending, and it is a completely separate issue. So if Harvey Weinstein is a sex addict, I hope he will get the help he needs. And if he is guilty of what he's been accused of, I hope he gets locked up as well. They're not mutually exclusive, she says. Unfortunately, it has again cast doubt on the whole sex addiction label and left ordinary guys finding it harder to reach out. Oh, I forgot to introduce Sparky Sprout, my co-presenter today. He's sleeping on the job. Okay, getting back to the story, sorry. As one client said to me, I'm worried that even being here, people will assume that I'm predatory. The clients who come to Hall seeking help are often in a state of great distress and not infrequently suicidal. They want to stop doing what they're doing, be it watching porn, visiting prostitutes, or using the internet to organize fleeting sexual encounters. But they can't, in much the same way that the compulsive gambler can't stop gambling, even though it's destroying his life. The article went on to describe the story of a sex addict called Rob Joy. It reads, "When things were at their worst, Rob Joy would hold his head in tears of frustration and smash another mobile phone, while his wife lay asleep in blissful ignorance upstairs in bed. The 39-year-old owner of a decorating company would destroy his phones to stop himself from viewing pornography or texting or sexting women in provocative or inappropriate ways. As compulsive sexual behaviors go, Joy's were a long way from the most extreme. On Carnes' scale, he would classify as a level 1. But it was enough to lead to a crisis that saw him lose his job, his friends, and effectively his home. What made the situation particularly difficult was that his job was that of an evangelical Christian pastor in a respectable Northamptonshire market town. One day, 3 years ago, he tried to steer a conversation via text with a woman from his congregation in a similar direction, but she reported him to church leaders who conducted investigation. They looked at Joy's computer and found porn sites and incriminating emails. His world fell apart. Within days, he was dismissed, ostracized by his community, and had to move away from the village. The family spent months sleeping on his in-laws' sitting room floor. In the aftermath, Joy felt humiliated, depressed, and full of remorse. It was at that low point that he decided to seek treatment for sex addiction. The vast majority of sex addicts who seek help are male, though many studies, including Paula Hall's own, have shown that 30% are female. So why are they not seeking help? There's a lot more shame for women, says Hall. We accept a man being a bit of a player, a bit of a lad, but a woman's going to get a lot more societal shunning. The story goes on to feature Erica Garza talking about her own recovery and her memoir titled Getting Off, One Woman's Journey Through Sex and Porn Addiction, whom I featured on my very first Sex Addiction in the News show and will be on the show interviewed live next week. Then the story returns to Pastor Rob Joy. Like many addicts, Joy traces the source of his problem to childhood trauma, in his case being introduced to pornography as a 4-year-old by older children on his estate. His father, he said, also had a lecherous attitude to sex and, in fact, died in a brothel while having sex with a prostitute. You don't want to become a victim, Joy says, but sex addicts are victims too. You see people being named and shamed at the moment, and their behavior is absolutely wrong and it needs correcting or punishment. But the way we are shaming people is causing so much more damage to them because most of them probably have similar stories to me. Their brains have been set like wet concrete at an early age. Luckily, Rob's wife, Lydia, has been extremely supportive and understanding. Obviously, I was very hurt, she says. Uh-oh, Sparky's gonna growl. It's okay. I went through different phases. At first, I felt sympathy because I saw how people were looking at him with total disgust. But there were also times where I felt just anger, mostly at the situation. But that came out as being more distant from him. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, it's okay. Lydia never lost her belief in his strength of character, but watching his efforts, she also regained her trust. Having gone through the experience, she has contributed to a book he has written about his addiction. I want to help people and the partners who feel they can't forgive or understand it, she says. My comment on this story is it made me think about Carnes' 3 levels of sex addiction, which were published in his landmark book Out of the Shadows in 2001. I think we've learned a lot about sexual victimization since that time. I will include a link to a thoughtful article by Dr. Linda Hatch titled Sexually Addictive Behavior, Severity Levels, Limitations on the System, where she discusses these issues in more depth. But again, I appreciate that this is making headline news in the UK and people are talking about it. Speaking of victimization, in Partners and Families of Sex Addiction, we feature a story from tvnewlife.com titled An Open Letter to My Porn-Watching Dad, written by an anonymous daughter. This letter was also featured on another site in a section called The Best Letters in the World, a collection of life-changing letters that writers have generously shared. Here is the letter. Dear Dad, first of all, I want to let you know that I love you and I forgive you for what I'm about to write to you. It is difficult to talk about, but I must say it. I had known that you've been watching porn since I was about 12. And so, I wanted to let you know exactly what your porn use has done to me. You may think that this affects only you, or maybe just the relationship between you and Mom. But it has had a profound impact on me and all my siblings as well. I found your porn on the computer just when I was starting to become a young woman. Firstly, it seemed very hypocritical to me that you were trying to teach me the value of what to let into my mind in terms of movies, yet here you were entertaining your mind with this junk on a regular basis. As a result, your talks to me about being careful with what I watched meant virtually nothing. Secondly, because of pornography, I realized that Mom was not the only woman you ever looked at. I became acutely aware of your wandering eye when we were out and about. This taught me that all men have a wandering eye and can't be trusted. I learned to distrust and even dislike men for their perception of women as eye candy. As for those modesty talks, you tried talking to me about how my dress affects those around me and how I should value myself for what I am on the inside. Your actions, however, told me that I would only be beautiful and accepted if I looked like the women on magazine covers or in porn. Of course, as I grew older, the culture we live in had only reinforced this message of beauty, belonging exclusively to someone who looked like them. These meaningless talks, in fact, just made me angry. The author goes on to write, when I had friends over, I wondered how you perceived them. Did you see them as my friends, or did you see them as an object in one of your fantasies? No girl should ever have to wonder about the man who is supposed to be protecting her and the other women in her life. And so I learned to trust you less and less, and what you told me didn't line up with what you did. I wondered more and more if I would ever find a man who would accept me or love me for who I am, and not just for a pretty face. I did meet a man. One of the first things I asked him about was whether he struggled with pornography. I'm still thankful to God that it is something that hadn't had a deep grip on his life. We still have had our struggles because of my deep-rooted mistrust for men. Yes, your porn watching has affected my relationship with my husband years later. She writes, the bottom line is this. Porn didn't just affect your life. It affected everyone around you in ways I don't think you ever realized. It disturbs me to this day as I ponder the hold porn's far-reaching, greedy hands have on our society. I dread the day when I have to talk to my sweet little boy about pornography and how it affects far more than those who use it. As I have said, I have forgiven you. I am grateful for the work that God has done in this area of my life. It is still something I struggle with occasionally, but I am thankful for both God's grace and that of my husband. I pray that by now you have left this behind, and that the many men who still struggle will have their eyes open. And she signed it, Love, your daughter. Isn't that a powerful letter? I didn't write that letter, but I related to it. And in fact, I recently wrote an article titled The Top 12 Reasons Porn is Bad for Women. And a quote from that article applies here. What I said is, what I have learned as a therapist working with straight, lesbian, and bisexual female sex, love, and porn addicts for over a decade is that what's bad for girls is often also bad for the women they will become. And porn, no matter how anyone might dress it up, is bad for girls. This letter is a great example of how a parent's porn use can negatively impact a child's sexual development, and I applaud this woman for so eloquently speaking her heart and mind in this letter. I think it can help a lot of fathers who have used porn as part of their sex, love, or porn addiction to think about and perhaps have empathy for the impact on their children. We hear a lot of stories in recovery about the first time finding pornography triggering a cascade of experiences and feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that eventually become or quickly become compulsion in the children. So in our LGBTQ and sex addiction feature, I want to follow up on last week's story on bisexuality with one titled Beyond Bisexuality, more on the variety of sexual attractions. This is from writers on reddit.com, and they write, bisexuality means per some I'm attracted to either gender, although I may have a preference one way or another. That's the definition I used last week when I talked about bisexuality from the article from Rob Weiss. But others define bisexuality as being attracted to any gender, including women, men, transgender people, or people who don't wish to define themselves by gender. Heteroflexible is a term that means I'm almost exclusively straight, but I've made an exception or two. Homoflexible is a term that means I'm almost exclusively gay, but I've made an exception or two. Some use the term pansexuality just to describe their sexual orientation, saying, I'm attracted to people, not gender. So I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to share it. I want to make a clear distinction between someone who has attractions besides heteronormative or heterosexual attractions and sexual addiction. They are totally different. One is who someone's attracted to. As an individual and certified sex addiction therapist, I am bound by an ethical commitment to try to never change someone's sexual orientation, nor would I ever want to. I'm happy to say that that actually is illegal in Washington State. It's called reparative therapy. And I just saw a public service announcement about this on the side of a bus in Seattle. And I love how our laws are protecting LGBTQ kids from unethical therapists. In sex addiction therapy, we see variants of sexual behavior that are problematic not because of sexual orientation, but because of two primary reasons. Well, many reasons, but two include they involve painful obsessions and compulsions, regardless of who their attractions are toward, that the individual cannot stop, and it causes them problems, and it gets worse over time and more intense. And two, they involve betrayal, deception, and other types of harm to themselves or others. Now, there are two chapters in the classic book, Mending a Shattered Heart, A Guide for Partners of Sex Addicts by Stephanie Carnes that are relevant here. In addition to two books I featured on my show before, Lesbian Love Addiction and Cruise Control. In Mending a Shattered Heart, there are two chapters, and one's called How Does Sex Addiction and Infidelity Affect Gay Couples for Partners in Same-Sex Relationships? And another chapter called Straight Guys, Is My Partner Gay? For partners of male addicts who have sexual attractions to other men. So check them out for more resources. And I'll include the links on the YouTube video so you can see that story if you go there. In Sex Addiction and Sports tonight, did you know that baseball legend Darryl Strawberry has publicly shared his sex addiction and recovery? This story broke at the end of last year, December 2017, as was picked up by USA Today, Sports Illustrated, and other major and smaller news outlets. The USA Today story reads, former Major League slugger Darryl Strawberry's struggles with drug addiction have been well documented, although he opened up on the Dr. Oz show about his sexual addiction that led to him having relations between innings of games. It was a pretty crazy lifestyle, you know, Strawberry said in the interview that runs on Thursday's show. All addictions have to do with behavior. Strawberry, age 55, played 17 seasons in the majors with the New York Mets, Los Angeles Dodgers, and the New York Yankees. He said coaches and teammates covered for him as he had sex during games. Dr. Oz remarked to Strawberry that this was enabling behavior, which I agree with. To contrast this, we have another major league team taking a different approach to something we hear about all the time with compulsive sexual behavior, and that's pornography. The Kansas City Royals baseball team sounds like an organization that would not enable a player's sexual addiction, according to this story. The news comes from the New York Post on March 8th of this year, titled, "How Royals Became the First Major League Baseball Team to Take a Stand Against Porn" by Jacqueline Hendricks. In it, we hear how the Kansas City Royals baseball team made room for an anti-porn seminar in their spring training lineup this year. The story reads, following picture Daniel Duffy's DUI arrest over the summer, General Manager Dayton Moore spoke of outside distractions and the potential impact on players' psyches at his press conference last August, touching upon the adult film industry as well. He says, "We've done a lot of leadership stuff with our players, very transparent about things that happen in our game, not only with drugs and alcohol. We talk about pornography and the effects of what that does in the minds of players and the distraction and how that leads to abuse of domestic abuse, to abuse of women, how it impacts relationships. We talk about a lot of things, and I don't mind sharing it with you." Way to go, Royals, for going public about talking with their players. I just think, again, perhaps Darryl Strawberry could have gotten help a lot earlier if his team had been able to see and intervene on his sexual acting out behaviors. Sadly, the Royals have been subject to some media ridicule and scorn for their action, for stepping up and talking about some of the real issues impacting their players today. I, myself, would love to see other sports teams step up to these mature discussions. And I do want to acknowledge that Darryl Strawberry has gone on to be found and be a representative of drug and alcohol treatment centers, and he's doing a lot to try to help the still suffering addict. Hold on a second, had a little news blip here. Sorry about that. The next story is, what does it mean when we call addiction a brain disorder? And it comes out of the Scientific American. Let's see if I can get it a little bit bigger for me to read here for you. Sorry about this. Bear with me, folks. Gotta love live TV, but I'm just happy that I actually have more of technology working pretty well today compared to last week. Okay. So, calling addiction a brain disorder. Again, it was a story by Nora Volkow on March 23, 2018. The term acknowledges that addiction is a chronic, treatable mental condition involving changes to circuits involved in reward, stress, and self-control. The author writes, "As a young scientist in the 1980s, I used then new imaging techniques to look at the brains with people with drug addictions and, for comparison, people without drug problems. As we began to track and document these unique pictures of the brain, my colleagues and I realized that these images provided the first evidence in humans that there were changes in the brains of addicted individuals that could explain the compulsive nature of their drug taking. The changes were so stark in humans that in some cases it was even possible to identify which people suffered from addiction just by looking at their brain images. Alan Leshner, who was the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the time, immediately understood the implications of those findings, and it helped to solidify the concept of addiction as a brain disease. Over the past 3 decades, a scientific consensus has emerged that addiction is a chronic but treatable medical condition, as stated, involving changes to circuits involved in reward, stress, and self-control that has helped researchers identify neurobiological abnormalities that can be targeted with therapeutic intervention. It also is leading the creation of improved ways of developing addiction treatments in the healthcare system, and it has reduced stigma. Informed Americans no longer view addiction as a moral failing, and more policymakers are recognizing that punishment is an ineffective and inappropriate tool for addressing a person's drug problems. Treatment is what's needed. Yet the medical model of addiction as a brain disorder or disease has its vocal critics. Some claim that viewing addiction this way minimizes the important social and environmental causes, as though saying addiction is a disorder of the brain circuits means that social stresses like loneliness, poverty, violence, and other psychological and environmental factors do not play an important role. In fact, the dominant theoretical framework in addiction science today is the biopsychosocial framework, which recognizes the complex interactions between biology, behavior, and environment. The article goes on to discuss the brain disorder model, neuroplasticity, and social learning impacts on addiction. It concludes, addiction is many things: a maladaptive response to environmental stressors, a developmental disorder, a disorder caused by dysregulation of brain circuits, and yes, a learned behavior. We will never be able to address addiction without being able to talk about and address the myriad factors that contribute to it: biological, psychological, behavioral, societal, and economic, and more. But viewing it as a treatable medical problem from which people can and do recover is critical for enabling a public health-focused response that ensures access to effective treatments and lessens the stigma surrounding a condition that affects nearly 10% of Americans at some point in their lives. I like that article, and makes me think about, is 10% accurate? Especially if we really start including behavioral addictions in addition to chemical dependencies or substance use disorders. I think the rate is higher. Our sex addiction book of the week this week. Okay, let me get back to the place I want to be. This week is a recently released ebook titled Overcoming Love Addiction by Lacy Bentley. Technically, it's not formally released yet, but she has made this book available for free for anyone who is willing to share their email address so that she can send you the ebook. Lacy was interviewed recently by my friend and colleague, Forrest Benedict. And Forrest is the author of a book called Life After Lust, which was featured in a previous Sex Addiction in the News broadcast. So I will include a link with the video post on my YouTube channel so you can watch their interview. And I found it refreshing to hear their candid conversation. So Lacy has coached women in recovery or healing from sex, love, and porn addiction for the last 18 years. She's a true pioneer in the field. And way to go, Lacy, for your hard work to publish this ebook, which I have read, and check out her website for other offers. Much more is coming from Lacy to be released. So this talks about love addiction particularly, and she has a wonderful emphasis on fantasy in her book that I haven't seen written about so clearly in any other book for women or for men. She really talks a lot about fantasy and has a fantastic, strong voice as an author. So if you're wondering if you are a love or relationship addict, I will include a link to a 40-question self-evaluation test from a website called Love Addicts Anonymous. And maybe share your answers with someone if you have concerns about it, someone that you trust, and if you need it, get help. I want to share once more this week that I'm excited to announce a first-time ever event at the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Therapy's annual training conference for certified sex addiction therapists. So it's basically a conference to train therapists of how to treat sex addiction, but they're also holding an evening celebration the first night of the formal conference, and that's Women in Sex and Love Addictions at the Phoenix Regency Hyatt. It's open to anyone, it's free, and it will feature two recent luminaries, Erica Garza, who I mentioned earlier, and Charlene de Guzman, who has also been featured on my show for writing and starring in a movie about love addiction called Unlovable. And they will be talking about their public efforts to educate about sex, love, and porn addiction. And we'll be seeing clips from Charlene's movie. After that, there'll be a panel discussion that includes Marnie Faree, a licensed psychotherapist, author, and clear pioneer of the fact of sex and love addiction for women. And I get to be on the panel too. So we can't broadcast that event, but there is some talk that we might be able to audio record it. So I will keep you posted if we can get access to that audio recording, because it promises to be great content. But what I will be broadcasting next week is this Sex Addiction in the News show, Friday at 5, from the conference from the Phoenix Regency Hyatt in Phoenix. Yeah, that's Phoenix. And I am going to be, as I've mentioned before, interviewing Erica, Charlene, and Amy Worth from Worth Recovery. And I haven't told them this yet, so if they're watching, I have to double check with this, but I really want to ask them what they feel about the differences between sex, porn, and love addiction for women, because I think at times I've heard each of them identify with one of those labels, and I'd like to hear what they say about what it means to them. So that will be recorded, and that will be on my YouTube channel afterwards. So I want to talk with you about how this show is going to be changing because, well, okay, the networks are giving me some bother. They said that the ratings are down, and I've tried everything to get the ratings up again. I brought my dog on the show, but it hasn't worked. No, actually, there's been a fantastic response to the show. But when I've looked at all the episodes and all the views and all the comments, what I've noticed is that the #1 most viewed show with great comments was the interview that I did with DJ Burr, my friend and colleague in recovery. And we talked about what recovery is like and many other things, and his book. And so I decided that I'd like to shift the content of the show perhaps to one news story, and then to move into an interview of luminaries in sexual recovery, educators, coaches, therapists, just people who are making a difference, who are also getting the word out about sex addiction recovery. And so I did ask on a previous show who you would like to hear from. I started asking people I really wanted to talk to, and I already have, well, next week I have Erica and Charlene and Amy. And then I've asked a woman named Sherry Keffer, I hope I'm saying that right, Sherry, who's written an amazing book about partners of sex addicts and trauma and recovery. And it's just a matter of getting our schedules together. And then I already have Lacy Bentley, who was featured in our book of the week today. She's going to be on the show. And I've asked a few more people that I haven't heard back yet from. Alex Katahakis has agreed to be on the show and hopefully talk with us about her new model of healthy sexuality, particularly for people in recovery. She has a workbook that she's published, and it sounds fantastic. So there's been some requests from people of who they would like to see. And specifically, I've had a request for Marnie Faree and Patrick Carnes, Alex, who said yes. Today I had a request for Pia Melody, so see if we can get on her schedule, and Stephanie Carnes also. So all these people I'm going to be trying to contact and ask if they'll be on the show. So I'll be sure to let you know in advance if they're going to be on it, if you're interested. And I still want people to send me stories if they have them, because at least for now, I think what I'm going to do is maybe highlight one story a week and then do the interview and highlight a book or two. So that's my plan. I would love to hear your feedback about that. I'm just evolving. And, when I think back to my experience of the show, the interview was really fun. It was probably the most fun I had. I mean, last week was kind of funny because the technology didn't work, but I think the interview was a lot of fun. So I'm going to try some interviews and see how that goes. Um, but thanks again for everyone's support of watching and comments, and just it's been a dream come true. I've wanted to be a broadcaster since I was 17, and I got to try it, and it's been great. And now I'm going to shift. So that is all the sex addiction in the news for this evening. Thank you so much for being here. I am really grateful. And in closing, I will say, may you feel loved, may you feel cherished, and may you love and cherish others. I'm Stacy Sprout, signing off from Sex Addiction in the News. Mahalo, and have a wonderful weekend.